Let us start our chapter, Characteristics on Developing Economies. I've done half part of characteristics. I made notes of these first 6 characteristics. You guys also have to sit with your pen and paper and with the reading. Stop the video in between, read the particular part, and also make notes side by side. That is the way to learn. That is the way to make notes. If you write yourself, you will be more confident about things. Now let us talk about few characteristics of these developing countries. There is a difference between developed countries and developing countries, which we know. But there is a lot of difference between, even among developing countries. To take up an example of India and Congo, which we have discussed in the last recording on human development, how different their human developments were. One country was very good in education, but the other countries are better. But the other country is better in income. It is better in health. Then, if you look at low income and middle income countries in the world, you'll find is that 84% of the population of the world is actually living in these low income and middle income countries. And what is the share of these countries in the total world's income? Just 46%, less than half. And if you look at, there is something which is called vicious circle of poverty. So if any country is at very low income levels, then the problem which comes is that at very low income levels, they do not have enough investments. They do not have enough funds for investment in education and health. If they do not have enough funds for investing in education and health, it would mean that the human capital is going to be very good. It would also mean this that there is going to be low productivity in the economy. It would mean that if there is low economic productivity, there would be stagnation in the economy. If there is stagnation in the economy, then again incomes are going to be right. But you know what? There are countries which who have there are countries which have actually gone out of this poverty trap. What are those countries? For example, South Korea. For example, Taiwan. They have gone out of these poverty traps, right? Then even among developing countries, there are countries which have grown very fast. For example, some East Asian countries. There are countries in sub-Saharan Africa which are growing at very low rate, right? And there is an intermediate growth in the other regions of the developing world, right? And you also have to understand that it is not necessarily true that the low incomes are going to come because the country is very small. ऐसा नहीं है that only because country is very small, then there will be low incomes in that country. That is not necessarily true. There are examples of even developing countries which are very small, but they have higher incomes. So that is one characteristic. So in case of the question comes, mostly I guess the question is going to come like this, that is the set of developing countries, is that a homogeneous set? Homogeneous means, are they all same? Or is this a heterogeneous set, that they are very different from each other? So you have to give examples in this. You cannot just write global gyan. You have to write specifically what is there in the reading. That is what is expected of you. Then the another characteristic of developing countries is that there is low level of human capital. We all know that human capital is something which is very vital for human development, which is also very vital for economic development. So if you look at developing countries, you'll find is that in many of the developing countries, enrollments have increased a lot. But are these people also completing their schools? That is questionable. So you have enrolled into a school, but you're dropping out also. And you're going to school to learn something, to get a skill. But do you have a functional literacy? Can you read? Can you write? Can you do simple arithmetic? So there are problems even there, that there is uh, functional literacy is not being achieved. That is one thing. You look at under 5 mortality rates, and what has been found is that if mother's education is going to increase in any particular country, it is going to increase, it is going to decrease the under 5 mortality rate. Because mother would know now what is it her child would need. So what kind of nutrition that child would need, and what actions she can take. So mother's education is also linked to the health of society. You take up an example of East Asia, you will find this, that the health conditions in East Asia are relatively good. But in sub-Saharan Africa, there are conditions of malnutrition, malaria, tuberculosis, AIDS, parasitic infections, all of that. All of that is there. In South Asia, even though there is some income progress, but there is also the problem of illiteracy, which is still there. There is also low schooling attainment. There is undernourishment. So all of these are the parts of human development, and these countries are being plagued by low human development, developing countries. Uh, but in primary school enrollment, if you primary school completion, at least if you see, country like India, it has improved. In 1990s, enrollments were 68%, but by the end of 2005, it increased to 89%. So you will also give, in case if there is any data in the text, and if you have to write that in the answer, better is if you can give that in a tabular form. It sometimes becomes easier for examiner to check that in a tabular form, right? You do not have to take up these notes exactly as it is. Please make them better, but write yourself. Then the another problem is high levels of inequality and absolute poverty. You also have to look at the inequality differences between among developing countries. There is inequality between developed and developing countries. That is there. But you also have to look at inequality differences among developing countries. How? They give an example that if you look at Latin American countries, you'll find this, that there is very high level of inequality. That is one example. Then Sierra Leone, Lesotho, South Africa, these are some African countries which have highest level of inequality in the world. Even some resource-rich countries, they say oil-producing countries, they are resource-rich, they are rich in oil. But even in these countries, there is a lot of inequality. And but inequality is something which differs among these developing countries, and particularly in Asia, inequality is relatively lower if you compare it within these countries. Then now about absolute poverty. You have to understand one thing, that extreme poor, I mean, if you take a very loose definition, those who are living below $1 a day. So those extreme poor, most of them, they are living in the parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and they are living in the parts of South Asia. And why do you think extreme poverty would occur? Extreme poverty is going to occur because there is political exclusion, because there is low human development, because there is social and economic discrimination against the minorities, right? And other deprivations. Now you have to see this, that when you look at the magnitude and the extent of poverty, then it depends upon what is the average level of national income in the country. So if the average level of national income is low, definitely poverty is higher. And how that income is distributed, is that distributed very unequally? So in case of a lot of inequality is there, then in those countries you will find this, that there is a lot of poverty as well, right? Absolute poverty is that the minimum amount of expenditure which you require for food, clothing, and shelter, very minimum needs. How much you require for that, right? That's an absolute poverty. And if you do not have even that much to provide for food, clothing, and shelter, a very, very minimum level of food, clothing, and shelter, if you do not even have those resources, then the person is absolutely poor. And World Bank estimates are that those people who are living on less than $1 a day, 9.1% people they live in East Asia and Pacific, 8.6% in Latin America, 1.5% in Middle East, South Asia, 31.7%, and Sub-Saharan Africa, 41.1%. So you can see the major chunk of extreme poor, they're living in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So if there is any discussion about reduction in poverty, it has to revolve around these two particular regions, right? Then the another characteristic of developing countries is that there is higher population growth rates in these countries. So some of the countries, developing countries, population of some developing countries, particularly in low-income countries, they continue to go very rapidly. From 1990 to 2005, population growth in the low-income countries was 2% per annum, middle-income countries 1.1% per annum, and high-income countries 0.7% per annum. So already they are low-income countries. And if there is more population, they will be more burdened because those children are not going to work immediately. And they will be again caught in the cycle of poverty. There's no other way. Right? Then they say this that even among middle income countries, there is a lot of variance. You look at the crude birth rate. In some low income countries, crude birth rate is even 3 times higher than the high income countries. So this shows what population would be growing in low income countries. Pehle to you do not have money to support your population, and the birth rate is that high, which is going to make population growth higher, and you do not have means to support even that extra population. Developing countries, they tend to have higher death rate in each age bracket compared to the developed countries. For each age bracket, from 0 to 15 years, from 15 to 59 years, from 59 years and above, you look at the death rate between developing and developed countries, you'll find this that developing countries, they have higher death rate. There can be various reasons for that. Of course, medical facilities have definitely improved, but are they really improved as they are in developed countries? That's questionable. But again, developing countries, they tend to have higher young population also. So in some developing countries, you'll find is that they have a lot of young population. Now, because they're young population, their immunity is also generally very strong. And because of that also, death rates are low. That is also one of the reasons. And due to the higher birth rate, these children, because birth rate is higher, it means children are more. Children are the dependent part of the population. They are not going to work immediately, right? So they are dependent upon the working age population. They're dependent upon the working age population. So it creates even more misery. So they say this that if you look at developed and developing countries and you look at the overall dependency burden, so who are the dependent part of the population? Very young people, let's say below 15 years, and old age people above 59 years or above 65 years, whatever you want to take. So those people are not going to work. They are dependent upon the working age population. So in developed countries, around 33% of the population is dependent, both young, very young, and old. In least developed countries, 40% of the population is dependent. They're burdened. They already do not have income. And they are burdened with more burdened population. You look at children. Children as a percentage of dependent population. You'll find is that in LDC, out of the total dependent population, what is dependent population? Children plus old age. Out of the total dependent population in LDC is 85% of children. Right? But in developed countries, it is only 53%. So you can see children are there. They have to be cared for. They have to be given better schooling, for which they don't have resources. There are expenditures on giving them better health, but they do not have those resources with them. Then percentage of population below 15 years, just see. In sub-Saharan Africa, it is 44%. 44% of the population is below 15. How can you expect that country will grow? How much they can work? How much they know? Latin America, 30%, and in Asia, it is 19%. So dependency burden also, it varies across developing countries. So all of these points, when you will write in the answer, you will write that, yes, there are differences between developed and developing countries, which is well known. But even among developing countries, they are not the homogeneous set. They are very different from each other. So you will give different examples to show this. Right? So you can show this easy, and then you can show there is one part of developing country, that is sub-Saharan Africa, which has huge children burden, 44%. And there is another part, Asia, which has relatively less than 19%. Then you have greater social fractionalization. So in many of these developing countries, you'll find this, that there are social groups, there are ethnic groups, there are religious minorities. And the more fractions which are there in the population, you'll find this, there is more chance of social strife. There is more chance for violent aggression, for violent conflict. What is also seen is that many of these developing countries, they were ruled by some colonial power earlier, right? Or in some cases, let's say, when Cold War ended, Cold War, between US and Russia, it was a Cold War for several years. So there were some parts of the world which were under the influence of US, and some part of the world which were under the influence of Russia. But then when that superpower effect, it wanes out, it was reduced. Then what happened? What happened was that there was violent disintegration of few countries. For example, Yugoslavia. Kyun? Because there were religious minorities, there were ethnic groups, there were cultural differences. But you can't just blame that because some country has religious minority, or they have ethnic differences, or there are cultural differences among population, there is not going to be much development. There are examples where it has happened. For example, Mauritius. Right? For example, Mauritius. And there are examples also of very successful developing countries. For example, Korea, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong. But all of them, they had homogeneous populations. So they didn't have to worry about minorities as such. I mean, they didn't have to worry about so much of differences among population. So they were relaxed in that way. So they took their population in one direction. And then they also gave an example where discrimination can be very, very pernicious. For example, Latin America. You'll find this, that ethnic groups there, those minorities, they were behind in every kind of social or economic measure, whether it is income, whether it is schooling, whether it is health, whatsoever. Ethnic minorities, they were behind. They had lower schooling, they had lower income, they had lower health, right? But I've also given you example of Malaysia and Mauritius, in which although they were minorities, but they were integrated very successfully. Then they give an example of US, where diversity is taken up as a source of creativity and innovation, right? And then you have larger rural populations, but rapid rural to urban migration. That is also good. One of the main feature of development is that there is a shift from agriculture to manufacturing and services. But if you look at developing countries, many of the developing countries, they are still dependent upon agriculture, or their huge population is dependent upon agriculture. Huge population is living in rural areas. And because they're living in rural areas, and many of these regions, they suffer from limited markets. They do not have proper information. There is social stratification. And there is a massive migration from rural areas to urban areas in these countries. And what happened is that, are these urban areas really equipped that they can uh, take the burden of this huge rural population? And that's also questionable. So it came with its own problems. So we'll talk about other characteristics of developing countries in the next report. Thank you, Vita.